Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, today we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, today, fighting continues. There is serious fighting taking place in around Vovchansk, specifically fighting that is taking place inside of the city itself, and mainly along the Vovcha River. This is this terrain feature here. The Russians have moved up and secured positions all the way to the Vovcha River. And we're just kind of running down the Vovcha River to areas where the Russians have moved in with approximately 35,000 to 45,000 troops and secured this fairly vast amount of territory just to the north of Kharkiv. Additionally, there is reportedly another 35,000 to 50,000 Russian troops massing in and around Belgorod. Now, we have seen reports that the Ukrainian military had received authorization on the unrestricted use of the ATACMS, meaning the larger semi-ballistic missile to attack Russian targets deep inside the Russian Federation. Now, initially, it was believed that the Ukrainians would have the ability to strike at the maximum range of anywhere they wanted inside of the Russian Federation. Now, we received some information here at MFAN that apparently that was the case. Initially, the Joseph Biden administration had given authorization for the Ukrainian military to use these ATACMS long-range missile systems wherever the Ukrainians desired. Now, understand that most of the targeting information would be coming from United States intelligence. Now, at some point within the last probably 48 hours, we understand that the Russian Defense Ministry made contact with individuals inside of the United States. And the Russians had essentially threatened the deployment of low-yield nuclear weapons. If the Russians were, or the Russian Federation was attacked by these ATACMS missile systems, and especially on a regular basis, it is clear now that the Russians had threatened to escalate within the nuclear realm, meaning that in all probability, the Russians were going to detonate a 0.5 to 1 kiloton nuclear device somewhere on Ukrainian territory. Now, we understand that this attack may not have been directed directly at Ukrainian forces, but near Ukrainian forces. And that has what caused American forces, NATO forces, the Biden administration, to retract the use of these ATACMS missiles against any target the Ukrainians wanted to go after inside the Russian Federation, or at least within the range of the ATACMS weapon system. Now, they have authorized the Ukrainians to hit targets in and around Belgorod, where Russian forces are starting to mass for additional offensive operations against the Ukrainians. Now, you can see that Mr. Zelenskyy is rather upset. In this article from the Daily Mail, Zelenskyy slams Biden and insists green light to bomb Russia with U.S. weapons doesn't go far enough. And again, what he's talking about is that green light near Kharkiv, south of Belgorod. And this is the article. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has criticized U.S. President Joseph Biden in a rare rebuke, claiming that the U.S. decision to allow Ukraine to attack Russia with American weapons doesn't go far enough. While Zelenskyy, speaking at Asia's top security summit in Singapore, thanked Biden for allowing Ukraine to strike limited Russian territory with U.S. arms, he said restrictions need to be dropped. The U.S. last week gave Ukrainian permission to use American missiles to fire into Kharkiv, where Russian troops have been building up in numbers. But this is the only area they are allowed to fire into, and Ukraine is only allowed to fire certain weapon systems. Zelenskyy said, "Is that sufficient? No. Why? Because I have given you the example of airfields from which Russia is permanently firing, knowing that Ukraine will not fire back because it has no corresponding systems and no permissions." He said that Russia has the advantage with the restrictions put on Ukraine, as its armies can carry on using artillery and long-range weapons to hit quote-unquote civilian infrastructure. Now, what he means by that when he says civilian infrastructure, what Zelenskyy means by that is simply that the Russians are hitting Ukrainian military formations that are using civilian infrastructure. Now, very rarely do you ever hear about large losses of Ukrainian civilians in the ongoing war. Not on the scale that you could see losses of Ukrainian civilians. Now, you do see a lot of civilian quote-unquote infrastructure being hit. Now, the Ukrainians will report on civilians being killed, and that's a fairly low number. Usually 1 to a dozen individuals killed. What Ukraine doesn't report on, and this is very important, they don't report the loss of military lives. So when you hear about a quote-unquote Ukrainian civilian infrastructure site being hit, usually that infrastructure site is currently being used by Ukrainian military formations. And that is exactly what is happening. As it goes on, and that's essentially it. They have these weapons there, and they do not remove them because they know that Ukraine cannot target them with Western weapons, even if they fire against us, he said. Ukraine imposed emergency power shutdowns in most of the country on Sunday, a day after Russia unleashed large-scale attacks on energy infrastructure and claimed it had made gains in the eastern Donetsk province. The shutdowns were placed in all but 3 regions of Ukraine following Saturday's drone and missile attack on energy targets that injured at least 19 people. Ukraine's state-owned power grid operator said that the shutdowns affected both industrial and household consumers. Sustained Russian attacks on Ukraine's power and grid in recent weeks have forced the government to institute nationwide rolling blackouts. Without adequate air defenses to counter assaults and allow for repairs, through the shortages could still worsen as needed spikes in late summer and the bitter cold winter. Among the most significant recent strikes were an April barrage that damaged Kiev's largest thermal power plant. So Russia's going to continue with those large-scale missile strikes, and essentially they will continue to attack and engage and take limited amounts of territory. And that's designed, especially the fighting that took place near Kharkiv, that was designed to get the Ukrainian military to commit its reserve forces to these areas. And when the Ukrainians commit the reserve forces to these areas, that's when the Russian air power strikes. That's when they degrade and destroy these reserve forces that could possibly use as fire brigades for other parts of the theater of operations. The Ukrainians don't have a lot of reserves yet. They're having significant challenges in terms of replacing manpower. They're having a very difficult time in terms of getting volunteers and even conscripts to report for duty. And it's a tough road for the Ukrainian military right now. And obviously the Ukrainians like to portray themselves probably as much stronger than they really are. And that has been the Ukrainian modus operandi for quite some time now. And it's a war of attrition. And eventually, as we have reported, that there's another massing of Russian troops within the vicinity of Belgorod that is probably going to launch additional operations against Ukrainian forces. Now the question will be, will the Ukrainians have the strategic reserves to move additional brigades to plug holes as the Russians advance deeper into Ukrainian territory? Now, we don't know the answer to that. We'll have to watch and see what happens. But again, war of attrition will continue. The airstrikes will continue. The long-range missile attacks will continue. And the Russians will continue to prepare for the use of possible tactical nuclear weapons. It wouldn't surprise me in the least bit if we saw the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. I believe that if the Russians deploy tactical nuclear weapons, it is going to do more damage in terms of what has happened politically here in the United States. The media will portray this as the war is going nuclear. The war is going nuclear because of the incompetence of the Biden administration. It is a Russian tactic to escalate, to cause discord, and I think it will harm the political apparatus here in the United States worse than it will harm how the world perceives the Russians, especially if it's just a tactical nuclear device. But we'll see. Be that as it may, under the Joseph Biden watch, a very large conflict has just turned nuclear, when in fact, if it does. So we'll continue to monitor and watch what is happening. And obviously, as always, we thank you for joining us today, and more to come. As always, have a good day.